Hello, I'm Daniel Prousalidis. Welcome to The Long Way, a podcast of short episodes with long perspectives on building the common good. Welcome back to another edition of The Long Way. Well, you've seen the headlines, you've heard about the charges, the fines, and at least one arrest regarding churches or pastors violating public health orders in Canada. So I think it's time to sit down and talk about it and explore the contours around religious freedom in this country. We'll do that shortly with some special guests, Professor Carissima Mathen and Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. And by the way, in that conversation, we'll learn a little bit about why Father Deacon Andrew said this.
I have a celibate vocation, but I'm not called to be a hermit. And that's a very unique vocation. And I think most of us are not called to be hermits.
It's not every day you get to hear about that in a podcast. But first, let's set things up with a field report from Peter Stockland, who brings us the story of a very frustrated British Columbia pastor.
It's still spring, and right now I'm looking outside. It's about 6 degrees. It's raining heavily. There's a bit of a wind kicking up. So we're allowed to have worship outside on Sunday. So you can imagine Grandpa and Grandma and little Johnny and Susie. And you can imagine heavily pregnant Mrs. Smith. They're all standing out there in the cold spring breeze and the April showers. At the very same time, our beautiful 12,000 square foot building could be used by multiple groups of people, support groups, grief support groups, addiction support groups. They could meet indoors in our church building lawfully. We could have exercise groups of up to 25 people meeting in different parts of the church. We could use the building all day for a daycare center. We could use it all week for a movie shoot. But we have to stay outside in the rain. We can't use the church for the purpose for which it was built by the people.
That's Reverend Rob Schouten, pastor of Aldergrove Canadian Reformed Church in British Columbia's Fraser Valley, describing in an elemental way both the concrete circumstances and the spiritual effects of his congregation being barred by provincial COVID-19 prohibitions from worshiping indoors together during the past year. Inconvenience and discomfort are compounded by being made to feel like outsiders in their own society, one that has forgotten the centrality of community prayer, song, praise, and thanksgiving. After months of imploring the NDP government to loosen the ban, Aldergrove and 9 other Reformed churches across British Columbia launched legal action in early March, asking the provincial Supreme Court to recognize the restrictions as a breach of charter rights to religious freedom. As I know from having given Schouten and the group some media advice when the suit was launched, it's not a step they took lightly. Schouten makes clear what's at stake is no mere fight for a legal abstraction. The motivation is the denial of worship practices and rituals, large and small, from weekly church attendance to weddings and funerals that are the lifeblood of every faith community.
In our congregation, 2 elderly gentlemen, both aged 94 years, have passed away in the last few months. They were both very dear members of the congregation. Not only was I not able to visit them for the last year of their lives, which, is extremely, sad for me and for other members of the church. We couldn't have a proper funeral. We couldn't gather to remember. We couldn't gather to weep together. So you have these, to me, that's a form of spiritual and emotional torture, when people can't gather to bury the dead. And same with young people getting married. Young people need all the support they can get to enter into the married state and have a good beginning. And it's one of the great features of our congregational life to have joyful wedding feasts. And so I think I've had to officiate at 6 weddings in the last year where that kind of public festivity was impossible. And you end up with this very lonely couple on the most important day of their lives.
He says discriminatory treatment of churches by the province and by its top public health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, is rooted in a form of secularist thinking that embodies both conscious and unconscious bias against religious faith and, by extension, religious freedom.
We have a government that is obviously secular and, in my experience, shows very little awareness of what religious faith is about, shows very little understanding of what religious commitment means, and to the minimal degree that it does understand it, considers it a private matter. So we're seeing here secularism, we're seeing the privatization of faith, and the assumption is that if you can practice your relationship with God in your home, what on earth do you need anything else for? Why are you so upset? About 10 days ago, Dr. Bonnie Henry actually expressed public amazement. She said, "I had no idea that gathering was so important for Christians or for faith groups."
There is no choice, he insists, but to fight on for those charter rights, despite the court's rejection last week of a similar appeal from the Calgary-based Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms. Schouten warns as well that some congregations are already so frustrated that they're doing what a vast array of other groups have done for decades to combat discrimination. That is, engage in civil disobedience. It's not something, as Christians, they want to do. But many feel it's the only option left to get the attention of a government that has left them outside in the cold.
Christians don't want to be in non-compliance with the law. Christians earnestly desire to be in compliance. Christians don't want to be at odds with the authorities. We want to live at peace with all men, and we want to live at peace with the government. So when we find that no longer possible, then the government needs to sit up and listen.
For The Long Way, I'm Peter Stockland.
Thanks, Peter. That's a perfect setup for a big picture discussion with our featured guests, University of Ottawa law professor Carissima Mathen and the director of the Cardus Religious Freedom Institute, Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. Let's just start with a general picture, and Professor Mathen, if I could, with you. Do you feel that at this point, 1 year into the pandemic, we have a better, maybe a more constructive understanding of what religious freedom is and isn't in Canada?
Well, thanks very much. I think that certainly in terms of the law, we had a fairly well settled view on what religious freedom is for the purpose of, for example, our fundamental rights under the Charter. And it's quite a broad umbrella of beliefs and practices that connect people to their sense of what is religious or spiritual for them. And that is unquestionably very important to our society, and that's reflected in our Constitution, which protects religion in a number of ways. I think what we're seeing in the pandemic is some understandable but also difficult tensions between how people manifest those beliefs and the communal nature, of course, of much religious life in the context of a challenge, namely a virus that spreads very easily and rapidly in certain kinds of communal settings and through certain kinds of activities. So I don't think, as far as the law is concerned, that there was that much uncertainty, but the rub is, how do we navigate that tension consistent with our Constitution, but also consistent with other societal interests?
Father Deacon Andrew, what's your take?
Well, I would have to say that I tend to agree with Carissima. I mean, I think we had a fairly established understanding of freedom of religion in Canada, both in terms of the constitutional framework and various decisions that have come through when various cases have come up that we've had to adjudicate on religious freedom grounds. The present pandemic, of course, as you said, Daniel, at the beginning, has offered some significant challenges to public worship. And I think the fundamental question that we have to address is the question of reasonable limits. So the public health restrictions that came into effect and have obviously, vacillated somewhat, just depending on the state of the virus. The public health restrictions that have come into effect have affected public worship in a variety of different ways. But we have to determine whether those limits were reasonable. And I think in most cases, at the beginning of the pandemic, we can say, yes, these were reasonable limits in terms of restricting public worship, because we weren't quite sure exactly the way in which the virus spread, how it spread, the degree that we needed to control interactions of various types to address that. And so I think those restrictions were reasonable. And I think many religious leaders across the country agreed and were happy to respect public health directives. Then, as the pandemic sort of played itself out over the last year, we saw different jurisdictions take different approaches to public worship. So you have, for example, in Ontario, where the province, sort of restricted public worship to 30% of fire capacity in buildings. And that then went down when we had the little uptick after Christmas, and there was a lockdown in Ontario. So it was down to 10 individuals in a particular place of worship. Now across the province, we're generally back up around the 30% level. But those restrictions were also similar to what we found in other indoor spaces. And so there's a degree, I would say, of equity across indoor spaces. In British Columbia, however, that has not been the case. Places of worship have been effectively shuttered for the last number of months, only allowing 10 people to gather for specific occasions such as weddings, baptisms, and funerals, so effectively privatizing that worship. While at the same time, there's in-restaurant dining and various other restrictions were less significant. And so I think, there's been a difference in jurisdictions, and I think that's something we have to consider when we're looking at this question of reasonable limits.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the situation in British Columbia, because it was just in mid-March that BC's Supreme Court upheld those provincial orders in that province on in-person worship services, despite what the judge acknowledged was a violation of religious freedom, though he felt it was a justified violation. Professor Mathen, how do you react to what has happened in BC and kind of the contrast with the rest of Canada?
Well, I think what we've seen in a number of the court challenges, not all of them, but in a number of them, is that the courts really do take the pandemic as constituting an extraordinary situation to which the government is responding, and are tending to give, frankly, more latitude to the state to take decisions which clearly infringe on a number of protected charter rights than would be the case in ordinary times. And I think it's interesting to see how this conversation has evolved. So in April and May, when we were first dealing with the pandemic, I think most legal scholars anticipated that the courts would be fairly deferential to the state. The longer that went on, we thought courts might tend to resile a bit from that deferential point of view. But the issue is that the nature of the pandemic has also changed and is unstable and shifting, and our knowledge even of how the virus moves. You might recall that in April, we were all wiping down our groceries because of a fear of surfaces. And now it seems to be pretty clear that, in some cases, the virus can be transmitted just through aerosol means. So that really has had an effect, I think, on the courts being cautious in intervening too far. That said, there are legitimate arguments to be raised about the differential treatment, as Andrew noted, treating activities in different ways when you might think that their level of risk is similar, or where the activity accompanies a very important constitutional and social right, that is namely freedom of religion. So I have to say, I'm not entirely surprised at what a number of courts have done in terms of dealing with these constitutional challenges. I do think that as we continue to see these challenges, as they move up the judicial hierarchy, there may well be a point at which the courts do start to take a more active role in really interrogating what it is that the state is doing.
I wonder if we could just step back a bit from the legality, I guess the legal aspects of the question, and try to look at maybe the social aspect of all of this. And I'd like to hear from both of you on something that it's an intuition perhaps on my part, or maybe just a guess is perhaps a fair way to put it. But I'm wondering if what we see in Canada, or at least in parts of Canada, different governments have different judgments to make. But I wonder if part of what we see is that a great number of people view religion and religious freedom, therefore, as something that applies to other people, or maybe a specific subgroup of people and a minority of people, and that it is something that is private. And so that when you see it that way, there is, I guess, maybe a greater willingness to give latitude to restrict expression of that religion, as long as you're not, banning it outrightly, and you're not banning what people do privately. But there's a greater good that they see as being served in that, because of that understanding of both religion and religious freedom. Professor Mathen, maybe we could start with you. Do you think that's at play at any level here?
It's a great question. It's a complicated question because, of course, it draws on a number of disparate things, like the public, which of course is extremely diverse and made up of people with all different manner of experiences and belief systems. And then the state, the decision makers, and the pressures to which they're responding. So I would say that I think in terms of the state, at least the provinces, for example, that make these regulations, I think they seem to acknowledge the value and importance of religious activity to the extent that they have always permitted certain kinds of gatherings that are, associated with religious life. So certain kinds of important life celebrations, I mean, those have been permitted, of course, under very, very great restrictions. I'm talking about funerals and so forth. In terms of you mentioned that the idea that people view religion as private. I mean, that brings up a really interesting point, which is, what is the place of religion in our public life, in our public square? And that's a point on which people can reasonably disagree. I mean, I tend to think that religion functions best when it is given the regard and space and independence that it can best employ, when it is seen as more individual or more separate from the state. So I don't necessarily see that as a detriment to the protection of religion. So maybe I'll stop there, though, because I'd be really interested to know what Andrew thinks.
Father Deacon Andrew, how do you fall on this issue, not only as director of the Cardus Religious Freedom Institute, but as someone who has a religious vocation too?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really the fundamental question around understanding religious freedom is, what is the nature of religion within our society? What is the nature of belief within our society? And, there's a bit of a battle going on within academic circles in particular around the nomenclature for this freedom. Is it freedom of religion, or should we be saying freedom of religion or belief? Implying that if you add on belief, that captures people who don't maybe have a theistic, belief system, maybe secular humanists, or they pursue a particular philosophy or what have you. And I think we have to recognize that religious freedom, just as all fundamental freedoms, these are freedoms that we hold simply by being human beings. These are not freedoms that have been given to us by any external authority. Rather, external authorities such as the state are bound to recognize and give pretty wide latitude for these freedoms to be expressed. So religious freedom really comes to this essential quality of our humanity, which is that we have this innate desire to seek meaning, to seek those things that are beyond us, to seek truth, to seek and understand the world around us, to understand our relationship with one another, our relationship with what is transcendent. And so that is so inherent to our human experience that we have to ensure that people have the ability to explore that side of themselves and express the beliefs, especially when they come to an understanding of the truth. They want to be able to live that out. So while certainly there are aspects of religious adherence and religious practice that are private, I have my own private prayer life. Religion, in the case of, if you look at through all of human history, religion has been lived out both privately and publicly. And so while we're always free to express our religious faith privately, even if someone is being persecuted for what they believe in a given country, let's say they've been thrown into prison for what they believe, or they're in hiding, they can't live out their faith publicly, they're still free in their inner life of faith. Religious freedom, as we understand it, in terms of the Constitution, in terms of fundamental freedoms, I think really points to it as a public reality that I need to have as a human being. I need to have the freedom to live out my religious beliefs or whatever philosophical beliefs I have in the public square. Now, I agree with Carissima. I think the state, first of all, has to give a very broad room for religious freedom, but the state should not necessarily be favoring one particular religion or one particular expression of belief. And so I certainly agree with that. It has to have what I think one philosopher called sort of a free market approach to religious expression. Charles Taylor has talked about closed secularism versus open secularism. Closed secularism, where there's sort of a prescription around religion in the public square, it's prescribed, whereas open secularism basically says, yes, with respect for the limits that are reasonable in a free and democratic society, as we read in the Charter, religion should be able to express itself publicly in the public sphere. So I think we have to distinguish between the whole question of establishment, which is has a bit of a different legal understanding in Canada than in, say, the United States. But the idea of a fusion of church and state, or mosque and state, or any other religion and state is really not what we're advocating when we advocate religious freedom. We're advocating for that ability for individual human beings on their own, but also collectively, to express their faith, because typically we do so both privately and publicly, singularly and collectively.
Just very quickly from both of you as we wrap up, and again, Professor Mathen, let me start with you. Are we in a better place, publicly speaking, legally speaking, in terms of our understanding and appreciation of religious freedom today than we were a year ago? That's. So, I know I said a quick answer, and maybe that's not necessarily possible.
I would just like to take a few seconds to say that I agree with much of what Andrew has just said, and I think possibly my understanding of the terms public and private are different from the way that he was articulating it. Because to me, speaking as a constitutional lawyer and scholar, public very much means with the involvement of the state. So I just want to put that, I was not suggesting that religion is something that is wholly to be relegated to only private settings. I just want to be clear on that so that there's no confusion. Are we in a better place? I mean, I don't know that we're in a better place in any respect right now, speaking as we have just passed the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic. Certainly, we're in a better place in some respects, that we can see a bit of the light at the end of the tunnel, the marvels of scientific discovery and the hope that is provided by the vaccines. In terms of the damage that COVID has wrought to our society, I mean, that's ongoing and profound. In terms of our understanding of religious freedom, I think certainly that COVID has been a sort of crucible for really viewing religion as an important interest that has to be balanced against the state's other goals. And I guess what I would say is I think we're in the middle of that process, so it's a little hard for me to offer a retrospective at this point, but I'm hopeful.
Father Deacon Andrew?
I would agree with Carissima. I think that's very well said. I would emphasize one particular point, and that is, I think and I pray that the experience of the pandemic will further reveal to us the importance of human community. We cannot thrive outside of community. And, as I put it rather pithily in a piece that I wrote for Cardus's magazine Comment, I have a celibate vocation, but I'm not called to be a hermit. And that's a very unique vocation. And I think most of us are not called to be hermits, where we desire the presence, the physical presence of other people. I think that's why we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue and various other types of social media fatigue, because we have not had that normal type of community engagement. And, religious freedom, in many respects, is affirming of community. Because, as I said, when we live out our deepest held beliefs, we typically like to do that with people who share those beliefs, and we live them out liturgically, sacramentally, but also outside of the place of worship when we go about doing things out in the world, whether it's helping to run a soup kitchen or outreach to new refugees, or whether it's engaging in sort of different types of civic events. And so really, I hope that we will see a revitalization of different forms of community as we emerge from the pandemic at all levels of our society. And I think faith communities have a particular expertise in this area. And so I look forward to that day.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Well, since recording that interview, I've seen a Vancouver Sun article that says the BC government is slightly relaxing its COVID-19 rules on worship services. Places of worship will be allowed to now hold outdoor services for up to 50 people, and apparently some Christian churches will take advantage of that in the lead up to Easter. But at least one Sikh temple tells the Vancouver Sun that the rule change doesn't help them at all in the celebration of their Vaisakhi festival, and at least one mosque says it's also cold comfort to them ahead of Ramadan because they don't have an outdoor space that they can use. So if you want to read that Vancouver Sun article, I will post the link in the show notes. Okay, well, The Long Way offers you a lot to chew on, and if you've got some thoughts, send them my way via media@cardus.ca. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on this episode and others. And give us a review, too, on whatever platform you use to hear The Long Way. It only takes a moment. Before we go, I do want to share 2 bits of listener feedback from our last episode on free speech in a toxic culture. Seems to have hit a nerve a bit. One listener who heard Danielle Smith's comments on social media writes, "I'm inspired and sitting on the precipice of getting off social media. Alternatively, to be on social media, but like Brad Wilcox, who uniformly posts research and analysis without a hint of snark, or Catherine Lopez, the National Review writer, who exclusively posts prayer requests, scripture, and hopeful pics of religious iconography. Amazing." And I also want to bring you the thoughts of a disappointed listener who didn't like that I called the last U.S. president odious in our last episode. And this listener writes, "We the people need to have leaders who truly represent our interests, and I am at the point where I don't care if such leaders are bare-bottomed baboons who fling feces around the office as long as they vote in my interest." And the writer goes on to point out some things regarding employment, Mideast peace, and security. Thank you for that. That's rather evocative imagery regarding a pantless primate, which could be rather dangerous for a podcaster. Whoa! Okay, in the meantime, I will keep trying to avoid the bare-bottomed baboon that somehow got in here, wow, that was close, and is flinging feces around. Keep that email coming. Thanks for listening. I'm Daniel Pruselides.